Hi, everyone. Welcome back for another Wine Spectator two-bottle tasting series. I'm Keith Goldston, the Corporate Master Sommelier for Land, and today I've got with me good friend, wonderful tasting partner, Travis Hinkle, the Advanced Sommelier, Beverage Director for the Post Oak Hotel in Houston, Texas. Travis, welcome.
Thanks, Keith. Really excited to be here again today.
Yeah, and so what's our theme today? Who are we tasting? What's going on with the two bottles?
Well, we are in the Napa Valley of California today, and I'm really excited about the winery we're partnering with. We've got Louis Martini Winery, and we're tasting two of their iconic Napa Valley Cabernets. You know, one of the special things about Louis Martini is they have a long history of producing wonderful wines, both in Napa Valley and in Sonoma. Today, we're really drilling down and going to be exploring the Napa Valley offerings, and so I couldn't be more thrilled to return to one of my favorite wine regions in the world.
Yeah, well, thank you, Travis, and yeah, I'm super excited too. We've got one of the OGs with us, and talking about Napa. As I've may have mentioned on a video shoot or two before, that's my home. That's where I grew up, born and raised, and is one of those spots that's absolutely magical. And of course, growing up there, didn't appreciate it fully. I wanted out of there as quick as possible. But every time I go back now, I'm just kind of blown away at the diversity of soils, weather, and just what a unique, magical spot it is for grapes. And I think the fact that you have that just perfect Goldilocks kind of growing conditions where it gets hot enough during the days, but then you have the very cold Pacific Ocean and then the fog that's created and the warm valleys kind of sucking that fog in. And it always just blows me away because there's a whole kind of East Coast bias and of like, oh, you got to have the four seasons. And I joke because to me, it's like many ways in Napa, you can get four seasons in a day. And it's just this perfect environment where the grapes get just warm enough. And then it's like, yeah, let's cool down at night, chill out, and get some sleep. But if you want to talk a little bit about the geography, kind of the layout of the valley, and why does that work so well?
Yeah, I'd love to. So everyone watching at home will know that Napa has become famous for these wonderful, iconic expressions of Cabernet Sauvignon. But what people don't always appreciate is there's a lot of variation within the Napa Valley itself. So Napa Valley, of course, runs from the north to the south, and on its southern end, you have the San Pablo Bay. The San Pablo Bay kind of acts like an air conditioning unit for the entire valley. What it does is it brings in that cool Pacific Ocean air, and along with it, the fog. And so towards the southern end of the valley, in the mouth of the Pacific, you've got these wonderful cool temperatures, higher wind conditions, and more influence from the fog. As you venture farther north, that fog and that cool weather becomes less of a mitigating factor in the way that you're ripening these grapes. Another qualifying component here, or complicating component, is there's Napa Valley is a valley, of course, and it's surrounded by two mountain ranges. On the west, you've got the Mayacamas range, and then on the east, you've got the Vaca range. And so lots of higher elevation vineyards. In the mid-tier elevation-wise, you have these wonderful benchlands, which tend to be areas where you've got these deep, kind of rocky soils. And then you've got the more fertile lower-lying vineyards in the valley producing a completely different style as well. And so for somebody like Louis Martini that has access to vineyards in different parts of the Napa Valley, you really have this wonderful painter's palette of lots of different vineyards to create and craft these balanced, really interesting expressions of the entire valley at a glance.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, and I'm always kind of blown away because you do have the mountainsides on both sides of the valley, and then you have kind of the alluvial fans of the decomposed rocks kind of going down into those benchlands and into the actual valley floor. But I'll never forget it. And it's actually when I was walking through Monterosso Vineyard, which is in the Michael range, but on the Sonoma side, and very famously one of the great single vineyards of Louis M. Martini. And the name Monterosso basically means like the Red Hill. And I think it might have been Michael Martini, but he talked about how it was very simple for the farmers when they were first planting California in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And it was kind of a simple thing. If it was red soils, you planted red grapes. And if it was white soils, you planted white grapes. And it, to me, always just kind of stuck in like walking through that vineyard and seeing how deep red the soils were and then tasting how great the wines were. You're like, okay, that's, maybe they didn't know it, but they kind of knew it. So,
Yeah, in that vineyard specifically, you've got these wonderful iron-rich kind of volcanic soils, and it's at a high elevation overlooking the Sonoma Valley, so you're at about 1,000 feet. in elevation, and it's a historic vineyard planted in the late 1800s. And so you can imagine in a time before really wonderfully established roads, before modern conveniences and automobiles and everything, what it took to haul up grapevines, to plant those, and then eventually work those vineyards. It's one of California's true vineyard treasures.
Yeah, well, and in that way, I think it's a perfect transition to talk a little bit about the Martini story, because in many ways, it doesn't get much more American than this. Louis himself actually shows up in the U.S., Ellis Island, at 13 years old by himself, and basically gets from Ellis Island to San Francisco. I think it was like 4 train rides and 1 ferry later, and shows up for his dad at 13. Like, I just think about, like, our kids now, we're worried about how much screen time they have. But here's like a 13-year-old, like, get on the ship, go to the U.S., find your dad. And I'm like, okay, cool. And then he actually shows up in San Francisco, starts working with his dad, who was in kind of like the fishing business, providing smelt and clams, and decides to start trying to make a little wine on his own and trying the little side hustle of it. And it's okay, but he sees that he needs to learn a little bit more about it, and tries to sign up for a winemaking class, but they said his math wasn't solid enough or his English wasn't. So the way that he gets basically to kind of learn the basics of wine is he talks his dad into, hey, at 16 now, can I go back home to Italy to see mom? And dad's like, okay. So he goes back to Italy at 16 by himself to Alba, takes a wine class, then comes back to the US and starts making much, much better wine. So he's got kind of this hustle where it's a side business with dad, then the wine keeps getting better, better, better. Ends up partnering with people, with one of the few wineries that actually had a sacramental wine license during Prohibition. So was able to actually make wine coming out of during Prohibition, buys out his partners, asks them to change the name to Louis Martini Grape Products, because they also were one of the ones that were very smart about basically kind of creating the grape syrup mix that if you happen to warm it up and add yeast, it would ferment into wine. So that turns into a big deal. And then coming right out of Prohibition, put offers in on Charles Krug, didn't get it. Another winery didn't get it, but then found a piece of land in Napa itself and was able to buy it and open a winery, all for $3,000, which, if anyone knows like Napa real estate now, that's just crazy. And then, a lot of people like to say Robert Mondavi was the first new winery to open after Prohibition, but it was actually Martini. He was the first one right after Prohibition. So it's kind of amazing that we're almost coming up on 100 years for that. But always truly believed in making great wines, making them approachable, accessible, and also kind of that classic, pre-Prohibition, Prohibition time, where it was like you plant a bunch of different wines, you make different styles, and you just start to market it. But he always did stand out a little bit because he was making more of a drier style in the Italian vein than a lot of the French wines or winemakers who were pushing to the kind of British palate and the sweet wines. But kind of cool, he actually was friends with Michael Schumacher, who was, the journalist importer on the East Coast, who was walking through the barrel room with him, and he saw that the barrels were actually labeled by varietal. And he asked Louis, like, why don't you make the labels say that? This is the US. We're not in Burgundy. We're not in Bordeaux. We're not Sauternes. It's not Chablis. Let's call it Cabernet Sauvignon. So he was one of the first people to actually put the varietals on the label and really start pushing that. And then also planting Cabernet Sauvignon. So it's kind of crazy, these things that we take for granted here in the US, that, this just basic business guy who had great street smarts went, that's the right thing to do. So from Louis, who was making great wine, start to do the single vineyard stuff by isolating the mountain fruit, labeling it as mountain fruit, which is also kind of super novel that at the time, but now we completely take for granted. And then pass it on to his son, Louis P., not to be confused with Louis M. And Louis P. was that next generation of the U.S. kind of winemaker where, his father was just, let's get it built and sell it. And then he was the one with like Peter Mondavi that actually kind of went into the actual science of, okay, let's chill down fermentation. Let's maybe step away from these redwood fermenters and let's kind of bring winemaking more modern. And I have to say, like, his wines, like, I was lucky enough to have a bottle of the 1956 Cabernet and it's still to this day one of the greatest Napa wines I've ever had. So it's kind of cool. If you can ever find any of those old Martini, the Cabernet Sauvignon's amazing, the Barbera, those ones were so good. So don't be kind of shocked or put off by old Napa because they were really good. And but anyways, then we get into the grandson, Michael Martini, who also kind of blended styles where it was that rusticity of his grandfather with that kind of polish of his dad. And then we transition into modern days in the early 2000s where there was this, acquisition or merger with the Gallo family, who currently now owns Louis Martini and the vineyards. And then as Michael kind of stepped into retirement, brings us up to the modern day with Michael Eddy, who is the winemaker and is actually about to join us. So Travis, would you like to take the honors of introducing Michael to the show so we can get tasting some wine?
Yeah, absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, we're so pleased to be joined today by Michael Eddy, the fourth winemaker for the Louis Martini Winery. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you so much. It was, I have to say, Keith, it was really great to hear somebody else tell the Martini story for a change, because I've told it a few times, and you did a really fantastic job too. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. It's a crazy great story. That one of, I think it was Louis P who tripped and sprained his ankle, and a Mondavi caught him, and then went to the doctor, and the doctor was a Gallo or something like that. But it was Mondavi takes Martini to Gallo. It was,
Yeah, and I love, just like you said, that it really is a great example of the American dream. And, I would strongly suggest we still have a long way to go to make the American dream more accessible to more people. But in terms of something that we aspire to as a country, it's such a great example of that. Somebody finding a passion, pursuing it, and, building it all on their own. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's like even just thinking about it, getting a little bit of goosebumps. That's so cool. That's why people decide to pack up the old world and we're going for this opportunity.
Yep. Yes.
And then making that
Absolutely.
opportunity reality is incredible. So with all of that history and heritage, when you go into making a wine like this Napa Valley, which just even sitting here smells delicious and I can't wait to taste it, what's your philosophy as you look back on that, years upon years, decades of experience and history? How does that show through in the glass for you?
It's a good question. So I really am not trying to replicate any wine that the Martini family has ever made in the past. However, I do take very seriously, for me, it's quite meaningful to be connected to that story and to be a part of it. And so it serves as inspiration for where I'm going to head next with the brand. And I can give you several examples of that. Certainly when we get to the Lot One, it's an homage to some of our past. But when we get into this Napa Valley, a good chunk of this blend is actually from the Pope and Childs Valley, which may not be hillside, but are at elevation. And, I think you kind of touched on it a bit. The mountain vineyard sites have really had a connection with the family from the beginning, since Louis M purchased Monterosso in 38, and then his son Louis P did a number of bottlings, California Mountain Cabernet, California Mountain Barbera, etc. So there's always been this connection. And so again, having some vineyard sourcing that pulls in some of that character, some of that structure, some of that muscularity is pulling some of that inspiration from the past.
Fantastic. And Travis, what do you get as you dive into the glass? What's on the nose there for you?
Yeah, for me, this shows just classic Napa Valley Cabernet sort of style. And so, of course, you have that black fruit character to it, black currants, black plum, black cherry, with sort of secondary notes of dark chocolate, caramel, and vanilla. But one thing for me, and I always like to point this out for my Cabernet lovers, and it's something that sometimes winemakers don't like to hear, but for me, it's just typical of Cabernet, is you have this wonderful kind of bay leaf and sage component. I call it slightly herbal, but for me, it's the herbalness that Cabernet is supposed to show when it's just right and not overripe. It adds kind of complexity, and it shows that character of true Cabernet. And so I'm picking up that bay leaf component.
No, I don't take that as a criticism at all, because I do, when I'm pushed to say, what's your house style? I usually describe it as classic California. not way out on the uber jammy, not to diss those wines, but not the ultra ripe, fat, gooey, but certainly not old world either. But there is a measure of acidity and tannic backbone and some of those herbal characters that define Cabernet.
Yeah, and thank you for doing that. I know there is a market for that ultra ripe, fruity, jammy style, but there is, to me, I smell it, I taste it, and it's like I would gladly serve this to someone blind and say that's Napa Cab. Like it ticks all the boxes, and you're like, yep, that is Napa Cab. And also, too, the other part is, Travis, you call them the bay leaves. There is a lot of bay trees in the valley, and a lot of people don't realize it. And it's very much like eucalyptus. It's a stinky tree. Like you can walk by and you're like, oh, there's the tree over there. And then also, too, like just that aroma combined with, and I don't know, Michael, if you've seen this, but like, when you're on the kind of like dry, dusty old creek bed, and there's like the blackberry bushes. And it's summertime, and this just smells like late summer or fall Napa Valley, where you can taste the heat, the dust, the kind of brambly blackberry, the bay. It's kind of a ratatouille happy moment for me. So taking me back.
It's an exciting thing for me when my winemakers can kind of hit that right moment in the picking process, because again, these wines are at complete ripeness, but there is that sort of complex, that added layer of complexity that comes from hitting it when it's ripe but not overripe. Go ahead, Michael.
In addition to that, looking back to our past, certainly Louis M, the founder, I often refer to him as scrappy and having this combination of opportunistic luck and vision. But he didn't necessarily always follow the rules. He was a little bit scrappy, and he would do what it took to be successful. And so I don't hold myself to the tradition of the Bordeaux varietals. And so one of the varieties I do use pretty much every vintage in this cab blend is Petit Syrah. And so the blenders help to build in some of that complexity as well. We've got Petit Verdot in there, some Malbec. And those really, the Petit Syrah helps to amplify some of that really dark fruit, some of the richness in the mid palate. But then you get the Petit Verdot with a little bit of that floral, maybe green spice. And again, drawing inspiration from guys who didn't always follow the rules exactly.
Well, thank you. It's delicious, and on the palate, it's just drinkable. And I don't know if that's kind of just built into the DNA of the winery a little bit, but to me, it has that kind of Italian, like, I just want this with food, and I know it would complement instead of overpower. And speaking of food, please go to landryskitchen.com, where we have an amazing curated collection. It's called the Del Frisco's Sophisticated Evening, where you can get an amazing steak and lobster tail to go with this wine. And that's kind of a fun thing. You go to the website, they'll send you the steak, they'll send you the lobster tail, and then hopefully you can get the fire up the barbecue, because both would be amazing grilled. But I just thank you for making a wine that is totally okay complementing dinner instead of overwhelming it.
Oh, you're very welcome.
And then, would you like to talk a little about the Lot One? Being that that's a pretty special bottle, and you guys have won all kinds of awards with it, crazy scores.
Yes.
What's the story?
Yeah, so Lot One really had its inception. You referred to the joining together the Gallo and the Martini families, and when Gallo merged with Martini, Bob Gallo, first thing he did was go to Mike Martini and said, "What do you need to make the best Cabernet out of Napa Valley possible?" And that immediately led to the building of what we now call our Cellar 254, which is our micro winery, which is where we make all of our small lot, wine club tasting room type wines, and Lot One as well. And really what we wanted to do is pay some homage again to our past. And Louis P really got into this bottling of special selection. So Lot 3, Lot 7 for a number of years. And so that's where the name came from. The concept, however, is relatively new. We do use mountain sites, and I try to keep a great portfolio that's roughly half mountain and half bench or valley floor type sites. But the proportion of those varies dramatically. And depending upon the vintage. So for instance, 17 was a relatively, to me, accessible vintage, juicy. And so in this vintage, we actually leaned pretty heavily for that blend towards the mountain sites. And the goal is to maintain a consistent wine style, but use the different AVAs and sites from throughout Napa Valley to do that. And then we very stringently select down to, half or third of the lots of wine that actually make the blend in a given year. And really the goal is to capture the power, the density, the richness of Cabernet Sauvignon, but with a notable measure of polish and finesse. And a lot of that comes from the tools that we have in Cellar 254, where we're transferring the fruit via gravity so it doesn't go through a pump. So you get very good berry integrity, and we're able to extract very, very precisely. And then most of the wine's life not using a pump, and aging in 36-month air-dried French oak barrels. This vintage is 80% new. So really pretty straightforward winemaking, just under 2 years of age in the barrel and then a year or so in bottle. But nothing fancy, just a lot of attention to important details.
Yeah, thank you for that, Michael. And it's so fun tasting these side by side because the Napa Valley Cabernet has this kind of great, lightness and sort of energy to it. When you move on to the Lot One, you've got this incredible density without it feeling heavy. And so for me, it's all of those same kind of components that make great Napa Valley Cabernet, but with just a little bit of extra depth. Again, a complexity that you don't necessarily see in the other offerings.
Yep.
Yeah, and I haven't even tasted yet. I'm still working through the nose because there's a lot there. But those 36-month barrels, it smells like money. And it's this really kind of exotic, subtle spice. And for those of you out there, like the best way I can describe it is like that really expensive perfume that someone wears that you don't even know they're wearing it, but they smell great, versus like the Axe body spray that you can smell from like 20 feet away. This is that really expensive, like that's like someone's like cologne made personally for them. And when it's done right, it's a really cool, sexy addition without being too over the top, like a lot of people do with their oak, particularly on their prestige high-end projects. So well done.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You get this wine on the palate too, and it has this extra kind of layer of tannin that we didn't see as much in the previous wine. It sort of just floats right down the middle and very, very well integrated, but it's something that feels like it's really drinking great now, but also built to last. How long have you been making Lot One? Has it been around pretty much forever, or?
No, 2003 was the first vintage. And interestingly enough, the grape portfolio has evolved over time. And so you'll see significant changes, but in the composition, the vineyard composition over time. However, when we've done verticals, which has been a little while since we've done one now, but when we've gone back and done verticals, it's remarkable how consistent the wine style has been. Certainly, they're different, they're vintage differences, but in terms of having a consistent fingerprint, it's there. And it's sometimes surprising how consistent it is, knowing the changes in composition. But I think we've kind of talked so much to ourselves and to wine drinkers about how critical the vineyard is. Sometimes we forget that what you do in the winery actually really matters too. And the tools we have in the micro winery really are a big part, at least of the mouthfeel and the basic structure of this wine since its inception.
Wow. I'm just curious, and I'm going to ask it. I know that before working at Martini, you were at BV. And I mean, there's not many people that can like say I've worked for two of the legends of Napa Valley. But I'm just curious because with BV, there's the George de la Tour. And I know they got like the little micro winery set up as well. But I wonder if has the freedom of like being able to change up the composition, pick the different vineyards, is Lot One a little bit more fun because you have more freedom?
Well, that's a very fair and interesting question. I I think it makes the blending process a little more intricate, and it requires more iterations, perhaps, which, quite frankly, blending is probably one of my favorite parts of making wine. But I also, right below the Lot One, have a new collection called the Crown Cabernet Collection, which is all single vineyard and AVAs. So I get my fill on that one there. That's a different exercise. There you're really selecting and blending to magnify or highlight what you think is typical of that site. Whereas with Lot One, it's a vision of a flavor, aroma, mouthfeel in your head that you are trying to kind of put the dart on the bullseye. So it's different. I think, I don't know if I'd say harder, just maybe a little bit more complex. But it is a different exercise intellectually.
Yeah. Well, to Travis's point, I think the wine is delicious now, but I could easily see this going 20, 30, 40 years. Like it is, it's just got beautiful balance. And I think that's one of those traits that is necessary for great aging. And I think sometimes we lose that because people just want bigger, 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 but you need to have that perfect balance, and this has it.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And I think sometimes it's, maybe wine drinkers are under the false assumption that a wine must not be pleasurable when it's young if it is to age well. And it's just, it's not the case, in my opinion. Wines can be quite pleasurable when they're young and still have the balance to age quite well in bottle.
Fantastic. And speaking of age, like I'm just going to say this right now on camera in front of everyone, that if there is any older Lot Ones, if there's like a little vertical that we could put together for the post oak here, I know Travis and I would be thrilled to have that nice little section on the wine list. So you don't have to answer that, but just know that there is an open PO for some older vintages of Lot One, because I think a vertical of this would be super fun to share with our guest.
Well, unfortunately, I'm not in sales, but I can talk to sales. Unfortunately, I'm not in sales. Actually, it's fortunate because I wouldn't be very good as a salesman, but I have never argued with someone who wants to buy and showcase and hand sell my wine. So we'll see if we can do something.
Fantastic. Travis, do you want to talk about the Landry's Kitchen one for this? So if someone can't visit one of our restaurants or the winery, how can they enjoy this at home?
Yeah, so as Keith mentioned, we've put together a really exciting offer on Landry'sKitchen.com. And the one with Louis Martini Lot One is partnered with our Morton Steakhouses. So we're offering a land and sea kit, which will come with a wonderful piece of salmon, a beautiful strip steak, and of course, a bottle of Louis Martini Lot One. We talked about balance over and over again with both of these wines, but that balance not only allows that long aging process, but also makes it really versatile with food. And so that's why we were excited to put together two completely different ingredients. One, of course, your classic steak and Cabernet, which goes together like bread and butter, but also can do well with seafood if the wines are made well and the seafood's prepared right. And so we're excited to have you experience that.
Fantastic.
Man, you guys are making me hungry, and it's only 10 a.m. here.
then I think we're doing our job.
Yeah.
But Michael, thank you for doing a great job and honoring the tradition of one of the founders of California wine that I don't think gets enough credit. But I think Louis M's got to be looking down smiling, because the wines are spectacular. And thank you for making a great story and great wine that's still accessible and affordable for people to enjoy. And then when, with no restraints and shooting for the stars, you can still make a wine that's on par with, all those boutique cult producers out there, but honors a truly great heritage. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And while we're making offers, I do have an offer in honor of being able to speak to you gentlemen today, where if people want to order online from the winery, if they order at least one bottle of Napa Cab and one bottle of Lot One, we're going to include ground shipping. The code for that is SHIPWS, SHIPWS. So if you order wine from us, don't forget that coupon code.
Fantastic. Travis, you got anything for us to close?
No, I don't think so. Just a real privilege to taste these wines today. They're as good as they've ever been, and look forward to getting out there and being able to visit the winery again.
Great. Thank you, guys. I really enjoyed it. It was good to talk to you.
Yeah.
I appreciate all your comments.
Yeah. Cheers. Thank you. And,
Cheers.
look forward to raising these glasses in person, hopefully soon. Cheers.
Sounds good. Cheers.